Welcome, code aficionados and digital daredevils, to a podcast that's about to dive deep into the fascinating world of WebAssembly. WebAssembly, or WASM for the initiated, is revolutionizing modern engineering, pushing the boundaries of what developers can do. It's like a secret portal connecting your code to the digital cosmos. On this show, F5's Joel Moses, Oscar Spencer, and Matthew Yakabuchi will be your guides to this virtual dimension, decoding the mysteries and unveiling the endless possibilities. So strap in for a bite-sized adventure as we take off with WebAssembly Unleashed.
All right. Thank you, Tabitha. And hello, everybody. Welcome to WebAssembly Unleashed, your source for news and views about the world of WebAssembly. I'm your host, Joel Moses, and alongside me, my fellow WebAssembly fans, super fans, as it were, Oscar Spencer and Matt Yakabuchi. Now, as you know, here on WebAssembly Unleashed, we're always going to talk about what's happening in the community that's notable or exciting, and we'll provide perspective on proposals, changes, or updates and what they mean to the WASM standard. And by perspective, I mean occasional catty comments intermixed with nuggets of fanboy love. So we've got a great episode and a great community guest today. But first, I think it's time for a little opinion time with me, Matt, and Oscar. Now, Oscar, you attended a CNCF event recently where our friend Bailey Hayes of Cosmonics spoke about WebAssembly's Docker moment. That's basically a discussion of where the tipping point is to radically accelerated adoption, whether it'll occur similar to the decade of work that preceded Docker's rise to claim the mantle of king of container abstraction. Now, she argues, and I should add to good effect, and it seems with plenty of supporting evidence that it's already here, that it's happening for WASM. You were there. You actually were, I believe, on a panel with her and Chris Madison from Fermion. What do you think? Are we at a Docker moment now?
We are absolutely at the Docker moment. I think one of the things folks need to remember about WebAssembly and the component model and think through what we've been trying to build. Everything we've been saying about WebAssembly for ages, you'll be able to use libraries and things from all sorts of different ecosystems and things like that. You'll be able to compose software in interesting ways. None of that has really been true. None of that has been true. But now, with the launch of WASI Preview 2, it was the WASI Preview 2 is WASI Preview 1 rebased on the component model, which means the component model is actually here. It's real. So we're certainly having that Docker moment because all of a sudden people are composing software together in the ways that we've been thinking about it. You can take something and not to plug it too much. And I know we're probably going to talk about Wasm.io as well. But in my talk at Wasm.io, we actually showed off these sort of blurred lines between services and libraries in the context of the component model. And we showed how you could take something that is a running service, maybe something you would have traditionally deployed with Docker, and instead just compile a WASM component that does the exact same thing and compose them together. You don't need networking layers or other things like that. And you end up with these artifacts that are much smaller. You didn't include a full Linux distro,
Right.
with your artifact. So we're definitely at that Docker moment. We're at the point where we're going to see that influx. People are actually going to start taking WebAssembly very seriously.
That's cool. And I want to ask you a few more things about Wasm.io in just a second, but kind of continuing on with the Docker moment question. Matt, I noticed that at KubeCon 2024, our beloved WebAssembly vaulted straight to the top spot of a Kubernetes-related technologies list. That's the results of an EMA survey conducted there. It seems like LLM-related use cases that were highlighted there at KubeCon actually put it over the edge, and it actually narrowly outpaced Rancher and Docker. Is that another nail in the coffin of the Docker moment for WASM?
Oh, it certainly is. In my opinion, it certainly is. Let's take WebAssembly from the perspective of it's a fundamental abstraction layer. Now, when it comes to AI and ML models, I think we're going to advance and evolve the abstractions that we use. But right now, what does it take to actually put AI on the edge? I could use a Libra computer and then have to use C++ in their AM logic special SDKs, or a Raspberry Pi where it doesn't have an NPU, and if I want to use a TPU, then I have to run through libedge-std. I have to pull in PyCoral, which doesn't now work on Raspberry Pi 5. If I'm embedded with Rock chips, then that's RockPi, but that's also still very difficult to get started with. Half the documentation is spread around the internet and like buried deep into RockPi's specifications. So in order to really embed, in order to really get started with like single board computers, I have to learn a myriad different software packages. What we can do with WebAssembly and WASDNN is start to build these fundamental abstractions, and then it starts looking more like an OS and more like where we have drivers that I don't care about. I just load a driver onto my system, and then I start writing the same code, and I can move that code around. Coupled with the component model, where now I can link to RockPi from maybe PyCoral or my C++, and things start looking really, really positive, and the messaging starts to become concrete and realistic.
Yeah, abstraction of hardware acceleration is something you definitely don't want to get me started on, though. So I'm going to step away from that for just a second and turn back to Oscar. Oscar, Wasm.io from KubeCon, where it's a sideshow, but a very large part of the sideshow, to Wasm.io, where it's the whole show. What stood out to you at Wasm.io this year?
Yeah, I think the major thing that stood out was that, hey, component models here, baby. That's the big thing. Seeing folks actually, take it seriously and say, hey, actually, these are the ways I want to build things. These are the ways I want to build components and share them with people. The launch of things like WASM registries and things like that. It's huge to say, hey, there are ways to build and share components built on WebAssembly. And that's not something we've seen before. So just seeing the advancements folks are making, and even seeing all the interesting things leading up to, okay, WASI Preview 3, what's going on there, and seeing that excitement, definitely a lot of buzz from folks, feeling the energy and just so much optimism about everything that's going on.
So talking about things that build and things that run and the registry, that often that leads to us to a topic like validation and management and curation of registries, and that's a great lead in to our guest today. So it's now time to introduce our special guest. Thanks, Matt and Oscar, for your opinions today. Chris Dickinson, principal engineer at Dylibso. Chris, welcome. Let's jump right into this. First, again, welcome. Why don't you just start by telling people what you do at Dylibso and what Dylibso is all about?
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me. So I do a number of things across our products at Dylibso. Right now, I'm kind of focused on both our Xism line of open source repos, which allow you to easily plug any language to any other language and communicate across that host-guest boundary. As well as heading up our WASI Observe efforts. So that is taking the Observe SDK and instrumentation that we built for core WASM and actually turning that into a honest-to-goodness, like full-fledged WASI proposal. We just reached phase 1 this last month, and I'm pretty excited about that. But yeah.
That's awesome. And we're going to talk about the community aspect, especially of Observe, in just a second here. But let's just find out a little bit more about you and the reason you're doing all of this. What inspired you personally to get involved in WebAssembly?
That's a great question. So I come from a background of platform engineering. I used to be, in the distant past, I was a platform engineer on the NPM registry from about 2015 till 2018, around the course of the time that we went from something like 100 million downloads a week to like 1 billion downloads a day. And during this time, like we were service-oriented architecture. We didn't use a lot of containers or anything like that. I had always kind of like kept my eye on the container and WebAssembly space. What actually kind of drew me into the WebAssembly space over the course of several jobs after, where it's like taking a monolith and decomposing it into microservices at ease, or trying to build a hosted cloud platform at Seaplane, is how our technologies kind of inform our ability to build distributed systems. The thing that I keep running into is that we were paying a technical cost to solve a social problem of how to build and deploy microservices, deploy individual units of work. and WebAssembly seemed to have the promise of like, oh, we don't have to pay that technical cost anymore. We can actually have an abstraction that lets us decouple and decompose into modules without having to have, HTTP in between each of them.
Gotcha.
So yeah, that's a long-winded answer for like, I think it's really cool how modularity works in Wasm.
Yeah, no, that sounds pretty close to some of the reasons that brought all three of us in. Now, how would you gauge in its growth? How would you gauge? I think Oscar put it well. Kind of the rise from hype to functionality. How would you gauge where WebAssembly is right now? We've got Preview 2 out, and we've got some things that are talked about for Preview 3. But how far off are we to wide scale enterprise adoption on the level of a Docker?
That's a really good question. So I think the registry talk that Oscar gave was really exciting in this respect. One of the things that really gave Docker its moment, that gave npm its moment, is the ability for people to coordinate using this abstraction without having to interact with the people maintaining that abstraction. So I think that is like all trending to the good. Where I see some transition happening is that traditionally, like all the WebAssembly stuff has kind of been about maintainers communicating with each other about the technology. And now we have to kind of shift gears a little bit to talking to language communities to say like, hey, here's the value, like it's ready for you to use, and here's how you use it. And we don't quite follow the same path as Docker in this respect, because you can take Docker and you can kind of like put it in one file and say like, okay, you've taken your process and turned it into a container, and now it's good. You can ship it off to the registry. There's a more intricate set of things that you can do with WebAssembly, and I think there's going to have to be a commensurate amount of engagement with the language communities around that.
Gotcha. Now, let me jump back one step and just see if I can simplify the Dylibso contribution space. You've got XDism, and that's an application programmability plugin system writ large. Lots of different language frameworks supported underneath there. You've got ModSurfer, which is an analysis and diagnostic kit that's kind of geared towards what seems like a security and validation task. And you've got Observe, an SDK for adding observability elements to WebAssembly projects, and that's of course the one that you're pushing towards standards. One seems focused at application developers quite directly at XDism. The other two seem aimed a little bit at security app operations, SRE. Is that accurate?
Yeah.
Okay, now of those three, let's first start with ModSurfer. Can you give us an overview of how it interoperates with pools of Wasm binaries and what benefits it provides?
Sure. So ModSurfer is both an analysis tool, so you can plug in your Wasm modules or components into ModSurfer to get an idea of what they're doing, what they import, what they export, a quick idea of like how to use them in context. It also supports something called check files that allow you to statically say like, okay, it must adhere to this interface in order to be valid. And that gets back to like sort of the theme of Dylibso is to try and make it easy to adopt Wasm, to increase the adoption of Wasm across the board. Okay. So it makes it adds another piece of the missing puzzle for saying like, yes, this is ready to go into your CI pipeline and go from dev to production.
Got it. And you mentioned CI pipeline, and I think that's probably the place that a lot of people are going to push towards validation step being in place. But you've also got a desktop application and a CLI. What's the purpose of those things?
Yeah, so we started out with the desktop application, and we're moving towards something called ModSurfer Gist, which will be a more website-based thing. The CLI will be a component of that you can use from CI or locally to upload things into ModSurfer Gist. But yeah, starting out from a sort of like, I need to get an idea of what this Wasm blob is in the first place with that desktop application, and then kind of as we progressed, moving it towards the web.
Okay, we're going to talk about XDism next, but I want to just one final question on ModSurfer. What sort of security functionality does it bring to bear that you think the classical enterprise security professional would really want to know about for WebAssembly?
So WebAssembly is really only as secure as its host functions, as it's the interface to the host system. So being able to specify that, like, yes, you only do have access to these specific host functions used in this specific way. There's sort of the other kind of code quality, spelled with a KWALTY, sort of things, yes, of like cyclomatic complexity, et cetera, that we can kind of surface and say like, oh, what has this grown too much over time, et cetera. But I think the prime one is just really surfacing like the host imports. We also do a little bit of analysis. We kind of pipe that through an LLM to kind of give you a description of what the module may be doing, which has been kind of handy for us in the past to get a quick like 10,000 feet high view of like, what is this doing?
I can't wait to explain to our security people how to write validation functions for WebAssembly binaries. That's going to be exciting. I can't wait. So, Oscar, I know you've got probably some questions about XDism. I know that you have had a long and storied history in programmability plugins for applications.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So as a suborbital alum, I must say, like, XDism is one of those projects that is like, yes, like this is exactly like what I want everyone and their mother's application to be using to bring in programmability. Like the idea of a project like this that just makes it so dang easy to go in and say, hey, yeah, I just let me add some programmability to this. Like, you just ship me a module, like we're good. So actually, one of the first questions I have for you, with the advent of the component model, one of the things that's amazing about XDism is the fact of, hey, I have data that I want to pass from the hosts to the guests, from the guests to the host. And before the component model, it's sort of the wild west of how people wanted to do this. And so this is obviously something that XDism tackles. So I'm curious, well, what is the plan moving forward for that data moving between the boundary?
Sure. So this is something that I've been, you could say, thinking about this, sweating the bullets over, just like looking at this very intensely. I think there's an interesting space where like XDism models a host to guest interaction a lot more like a typical like RPC, remote RPC request response. It says like, okay, you can send anything to your plugin as long as it serializes down to like JSON, message pack, or whatever your bespoke encoding is, and we'll marshal it on the other side. And that's a pretty useful generic like just make my application programmable interface. I don't think that necessarily goes away in the face of the component model. I think actually it's two great tastes that taste great together. Instead of necessarily needing to create defined interfaces between your host application and your component in the future, you could easily imagine like using this, like I am going to talk to Wasm components over this message pack or this JSON, and then from there, these components are communicating over their usual like WIT interfaces. So again, our goal is to kind of like support both worlds. Like, there's a lot of value in core modules, and I don't want to like leave any of our users there in the dust either. Like, I think that will be a core use case that we, no pun intended, support in the future. But also, I think there's kind of like a bright future for being able to work with the component model inside of XDism and from our various host SDKs and PDKs.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's actually a really interesting point you made there. One of the things that we do have, and like, I don't know if you call it a limitation or not, but if we're using something like WIT, you have to have well-defined interfaces ahead of time and know, hey, this is going to be the shape of the data that I'm going to pass all the time. So as you're thinking towards the future, is there a world? So actually, that's another thing that I'm curious about as well. So I'm going to be passing, these pieces of data back and forth, let's say it's some sort of, RPC type thing. I still know the shape of that data, right? Like I still have to compile it. So is it really going to be all too different? Like obviously it's much easier, it's much quicker to say, yeah, this is the definition of this object. I've added this field to it, recompile, everything's easy. So how different is that really going to be from doing something like having to update a WIT interface?
So it kind of depends on like what the languages on either side of this are. Like you have the sort of like jellyfish-like consistency of JavaScript on the one side, where you can say like, oh yeah, it's got its like ecological niche. Like I'm just going to send JSON over and kind of loosely type it on either side and really rapidly make progress on it. Once I want to formalize that or optimize for performance, I can Carsonize it, I can make it Rust, or I can make it Go, and then you start to get into this world of like, yeah, the interfaces become much more reified, they're much more real, and you might want to switch into something like WIT. There is still that like, I don't think this is going to be a forever thing, but there is sort of the tricky problem of doing like recursive types in WIT. So like if you're trying to represent your JSON structure using WIT, like that might not necessarily be like easy to do or possible to do right now.
Right.
And even in the future, like it's sort of a Gordian knot situation. You could spend time trying to untangle that, or sometimes it's just easy to say like, oh yeah, we've got bytes over the wire. It's fine. We'll just cut the Gordian knot.
So you move your application ahead, right? Like you've created some interfaces that are good for you, and you can move your application forward. Yeah.
And then you've got the issue of streams, where I feel like you're in a kind of maybe a sticky middle ground right now, because the component model doesn't yet have native streams, right? So if I want to stream data in and out, the only way to do that right now in the component model is just bytes in, bytes out. Versus like having something like RPC that says, oh yeah, all right, I'm just going to stream these different types of objects in. So you're gonna have to wait till around preview 3 time to be able to do sort of that sort of thing. So have you been sort of grappling with that? Is that another thing that's just, oh hey, yeah, so we want to support this, but we want to do it right. So yeah, use your head out there.
Yeah, I am. So I come to this with a very like Node.js colored glasses from my past. So I have. For better or worse, like I have framed things in terms of event loops. There are other models of concurrency out there, but this is the one that I'm most well versed in. We do have that problem of like, okay, I want to delegate some asynchronous property from a guest up to a host, and we can do that now, but it does require a little bit of like getting out of the car and pushing, like you do have to sort of think through your interface at that point. I'd like to make this better. This is something that I've been kind of focusing on over the last couple of weeks. I did a bit of a hackathon project, kind of surfacing event loops from the JS PDK up through the JS SDK. This is something that this is one of the things that really excites me about the component model, is that sort of superpower of the adapter modules and it being able to fix the what color is your function problem. That is really awesome. There's also upcoming things like the JSPI stuff, stack switching, etc. that like I'm tracking along with this. But right now it is like the status quo with core modules is it's possible but difficult, and I'm hoping to make that better for XDism and kind of tracking along with how the component model is doing things.
That's pretty exciting. Would the host be the embodiment of the event loop? Is the host what's going to register particular events, and then it's like a callback system? Like I register this WebAssembly module, this WebAssembly function call as an export, and then I get called back.
So that's a really deep topic. I think.
Oh boy.
I think around the time this episode goes live, I think a bunch of the talks from Wasm.io will be up, and so we'll
Yeah.
throw a link to an amazing talk in
Okay.
Discord
Yes,
that goes
yes,
way
yes.
into that.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I definitely want to save some time for Observe because that's a whole other topic that could go extremely deep. But just to close out this particular one, is there some user of XDism that you've seen that is doing a particularly interesting plugin scenario? Can you describe what you've seen that sort of surprised you?
Yeah, there's wow, I have just blanked. That's a terrible time to blank. There are some really incredible uses in building sort of like LangChain style programs. I need to go find the person to give the shout out to. I apologize.
Oh, no sweat. No sweat. Let's move on to Observe SDK. Matt, I know you have plenty of questions about that. Why don't we just start with the first one? What is observability in this particular context, Chris?
So one of the lovely things about WebAssembly is that you get a pretty secure black box to do computation in. This is great for security, but not so great in terms of being able to model what's actually going on with your system. So a lot of the Observe stuff at Dylibso started the way like ModSurfer did, for example, trying to increase adoption of WebAssembly. What do people need in order to adopt WebAssembly? They need to be able to model what's going on with their program. Initial attempts to do this were really focused on leaning on the runtime. Like, what can we get out of Wasm time? What can we get back out of the V8 Wasm engine? How transferable across runtimes is this? And it turns out that the answer is they're not. Generally, that would require a lot of implementers to agree on a lot of very specific things.
Right.
So we kind of refocused on the actual bytecode virtual machine, like the abstract machine of Wasm, and said, okay, what can we surface from this? And we came up with something broadly useful. We are acting as sort of a pipe to the host to get spans and logs and metrics out. And we wanted to start the conversation with the WASI working group about turning this into a full spec. So that's kind of the history of how we came to this. It really is about being able to model what's going on inside of your program. And there's a lot of history and a lot of tools already for processes to do this, and we're kind of having to catch up to that with WebAssembly in a lot of ways.
Gotcha. Matt,
Yeah.
anything?
So this, if I'm not mistaken, Dylibso started something that you were calling Observe SDK.
Mhm.
It fit very well with XDism, but now it's being moved into the community proposal process. So it's a preview proposal. Now, what's your thoughts? What are your thoughts on what protocols and some of the initial roadmap items that you want to hit first? I really like that this is something that you're focusing on the ecosystem, like how to use WebAssembly, and it's going to be good for SREs and not just app devs. But you said spans, logs, and metrics. Like, which one is the first one? What protocols do you want to support on the wire? And yeah, where's the roadmap now?
So we are kind of a demo-driven process right now with this working group, or this proposal, I should say. The first thing that we kind of want to hit is just like getting the abstract concept of spans out. We're not specifically subscribed to any sort of format. We're probably most informed by OTel. The ideal here is that we're kind of a dumb pipe. The interesting stuff should happen on either end. It should happen either in your component, in your core WASM, or on the receiving side of these spans and metrics. That means like it should be compatible with Datadog or Honeycomb or OTel or Jaeger or wherever you're sending your metrics. Or if you're like just printf debugging, like that's okay too. Like that's still, broadly speaking, useful for modeling the behavior of a system locally. So the first real demos here are to take what we've got. The initial proposal is essentially the lowered version of a WIT interface that we use for the Observe SDK, and then to actually start representing spans as resources that you can actually talk about to the host. And this is to support things like threading in WebAssembly, where we can no longer rely on the fact that like a span that you created in this one guest necessarily corresponds to the same thread originated on. So essentially, we're in the very early stages. Danielle Endogrimes has a really great draft PR sort of formalizing the span interface. And I think the very first demo that we've got here is going to be just getting that into Jaeger.
Got it. And if people want to find a way to engage and help out, how do they do that?
There is a repo, WebAssembly/Wasm Observe. They can read my contact info is listed on there. Essentially, the main thing that I'm doing there is just kind of trying to focus the efforts on user stories and doing a lot of scheduling and inviting people in. So I would love people to come help out, especially if you have experience like as a observability vendor. We'd love to have more folks like that in, or as someone who has used observability in anger, or joyfully. Also,
mostly anger. Yeah.
It happens.
And just a quick plug for your bi-weekly meeting. It is on Thursdays, but
Wednesdays.
Wednesdays.
Yes. It is at 8 in the morning Pacific time. And if you want to join, there's instructions on the repo for joining that as well.
Great.
We'd love to have you.
That's fantastic. And I don't want to speak for Oscar and Matt, but I'm going to do it anyway. We really have a lot of respect for Dylibso and the fact that you guys are working towards making the ecosystem surrounding WebAssembly so much better.
Yes.
Thank you for that. That's awesome work.
Thanks.
Great. And with that, it's unfortunately all the time we have for today. Chris, a big thank you. Great discussion. And as always, thanks, Oscar and Matt. It's a big application world out there. It's time to unleash the power and promise of WebAssembly for everyone. For Chris, for Matt, Oscar, and myself, thanks for listening in. And be sure to subscribe for future WebAssembly news and views.
Yeah,
take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's a wrap for our WebAssembly adventure, fellow code explorers. Thanks for joining us. And until next time, may Wasm be with you.